Hello, everyone. Welcome to Film Roundtable. My name is Erin, and I'm one of the co-founders of Film Roundtable. And today is the 30th of January, 2021. My guest today is my dear friend, Ben Seresin, cinematographer extraordinaire. Some of his past films are Unstoppable with Tony Scott, World War Z with Marc Forster. Most recently, he did Godzilla vs. Kong, which is now out in the virtual theaters, depending on where you are at. And then he has a film coming out that he did with Doug Liman, I think, right? Called Chaos Walking, that I think is coming out in the spring. So yeah, so let's welcome Ben with a virtual applause. And before we get into it, I'm just going to do our moment of silence, where we want to honor all of the people who have died from COVID in this past year. So right now, as of today, our worldwide total is 2,218,394, which is up 100,000 in just 1 week since we did our last roundtable last week. And in the US, it's 437,000, which is 20,000 up from a week ago. We'd also like to honor all of our Black and Brown brothers and sisters whose lives have been lost by the hands of police brutality and other random acts of violence, as well as our First Nations brothers and sisters. So let's just take a moment. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. This is something we started right when we launched this platform, and we find it's very important to take that time and also just stay diligent, to be safe, caring for your loved ones, those in your community, keeping in mind that this virus is still real and it is still in full swing. So be safe. But now we'll get into our convo with Ben. Super happy to have you here, Ben. It's really nice. Yeah. So Ben, tell us where you are right now in the world, what you're doing.
I just wanted to say that's such an important way to start the conversation. I think, in the context of an industry that, we are all fortunate to work in, but is ultimately based on entertainment. I think it's great to acknowledge, the bigger issues that are going on in the world. So thank you for that. I'm in New Zealand at the moment. I came here 2 weeks ago, and I've been in quarantine. The New Zealand government mandates a pretty strict quarantine, which is enforced by everyone coming into the country, is required to stay in a hotel. It's a government run process, and you stay in a hotel for 2 weeks, and it's non-negotiable. It's the only way you come into the country. So I've been here 2 weeks. I get out tomorrow, which will be very nice. And we'll, see a small part of the world that seems to be managing in the midst of this crisis. So I feel very privileged and fortunate to be in that position. And I have family here, so I'll be out tomorrow, and I'll be going down to see my mother, who lives nearby, and spending a bit of time with her.
Nice. Yeah, it's such a beautiful country, and they seem to have figured out how to keep this a little bit under control. So
yeah, it seems so. It's, geographically, obviously, it's in a very good position. And, I think it's interesting being here because there are other benefits apart, from the obvious isolation. I think generally people here tend to be compliant and are able to look at the issues and act as a community to mitigate things. So it's good to see. It's nice to see a sort of a place that's sort of managing with some fortunate aspects to contain the situation.
Nice. So I don't want to spend too much time on how you got started, but it might be nice for listeners to know how a young man in New Zealand got going in the film business.
Yeah, well, I I started out wanting to act actually. That was my introduction. I have a half brother who's also a cinematographer, but although I was very aware of him and his work, I didn't meet him till I was 16.
Oh, wow.
And so he was really a figure that didn't represent someone that was, obviously someone to follow the steps in, but what I did become really interested in high school was acting. In fact, just prior to high school, I auditioned for a big television show that was shooting in New Zealand and in the Pacific Islands. I was about 12. And I remember that process. It was quite complex, and I'd had no training and no experience of acting at all, but became incredibly excited about the prospect of the possibility of being in this show. So I trained as hard as I knew how, which basically consisted of watching and emulating any child actors I could manage to catch up with on TV. And I auditioned for this role. Not surprisingly, didn't get the part, but it was a great taste of what really was the beginning of an exploration of movies and television, and fueled my excitement. So that was the beginning. I then went on in high school, did a couple of productions, and that really led me to sort of fascination with what we do. And it was really when I left high school, still with the idea of pursuing acting, that I got involved in some production companies in Wellington, where I was living as a kid in New Zealand. And the only possibility of any sort of experience was to just go and work as a production assistant. And I thought that would maybe open up an avenue for watching actors and experiencing what their process is. But what happened and what transpired was, once I started working really on these television commercials initially, at age of, I guess, 18, was I developed a real fascination for what happened behind the camera and the people working in that role, and really realized that what really interested me more, or potentially was a path to follow, was really the construction of the films and how they came together, the overall sort of picture. And that triggered a sort of fork in the road where I then soon after got offered a position on a feature film in New Zealand as an electrician, working with the lighting crew. And that was really the beginning. Once that started, I really realized that was the path I wanted to follow. Halfway through that first film, I got the opportunity to leap on board with the camera crew. We'd been shooting interiors for the first half of the film, so obviously a lot more or greater requirement on the electrical department. then we moved into these big, well, really the latter half of the film, shooting all the exteriors, and the camera department needed extra help, and so I volunteered for the transition. And the New Zealand industry being what it was at that point, there was a lot of fluidity. When I look at the crew list of that first movie, there are some pretty influential big New Zealand names who were all in different minor roles on that film. But it was great. It was a great learning process, and that sort of fueled my my journey.
What was happening in New Zealand cinema then, and like on a global level? Was the independent scene happening there yet, or were films coming out that were being seen worldwide at that point?
Up to this is 1980, and up to that point, New Zealand had a fairly healthy, but really very much a local industry. Great filmmakers. Lee Tamahori was just about to start out, and there was really, it was the early days. Particularly, what was particularly of note at that period was that it coincided with a very big tax incentive in Australia, 1980. They had launched a phenomenal support scheme for Australian films, and what happened was a lot of that, not a lot, there were quite a few films that came over to New Zealand, and even though they were Australian productions, were shooting here as a location, and we benefited from those. There was an overflow, and that really was a launch pad. That certainly affected my journey, because I did a couple of films here, and then I went on to Australia, where the momentum was still high. There were a lot of productions being made, and it was a great time. It was a real heyday of Australian cinema. So that I only did 2 films here, and then went to Australia, moved to Australia.
And how long did it take you from there to keep migrating west?
I stayed in Australia for probably about 3 years, I think. I kept busy. But as happens in our industry, the more you work, the more you come into contact with other people from around the world, and the more you realize there are people that are really interesting and better, and in my case, I really felt an urge to go to the UK. I started to become aware that at that stage, a lot of the films I'd really been fascinated with and drawn to were originated in the UK, and really the level of craftsmanship and talent over there was just phenomenal. And that's really what the driving force for me to move over there. And I have to say also, at that age, culturally, I was just sort of really fascinated in extending my boundaries. Growing up in a small town in New Zealand, I'd really been curious about what existed outside of my town, and by the time I was sort of hit my 20s, I was ready to leave. I really wanted to go exploring, and exploring within my work and outside of it went hand in hand. So I think after 3 years in Australia, at 22, I moved to London.
Yeah, I think to migrate from New Zealand or Australia west, it takes an adventurous soul, and there are definitely lots of them in both those countries, right? That have gone away and come back and gone away. But it's a far way to go, and not everybody has that confidence, to get up and go halfway around the world to a different place. It's not easy to get home if you miss it, especially back then.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I was obviously very lucky and privileged, and God, it was a time when, you know, after this year, travel was just so easy. But you know, the thing for me was I felt really constrained. I think, you know, my father was Russian and grew up in Europe and was a sort of interesting character, but very influenced by European culture and his upbringing there. And so I grew up with a real awareness of, you know, a huge cultural landscape that existed. And also, you know, as a kid, it's hard to appreciate the qualities of somewhere like New Zealand, which, you know, without doubt has, you know, phenomenal advantages, which, you know, I'm only becoming too aware of at the moment.
Especially now.
Exactly. But at, you know, at that time, it's like, you know, if you're curious, you're curious. And, you know, I think this is one of the fascinating things about the industry. That curiosity drives us in all sorts of directions. And at that point, that was what was fueling my journey, was just to explore the world and have, you know, explore what it was like to be out of my comfort zone. I think that's probably a huge motivating thing with me, is I feel, and it relates to work as well, I sort of feel a drive to always, whenever I get comfortable, I feel like it's time to sort of take another step forward. I'm not someone that's comfortable with being comfortable, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think also when it's interesting, because when you're trying to discover if you're wanting to be outside of your comfort zone or to push yourself, usually at that age, you don't necessarily know that's what you're doing. Instead, you're kind of like, something doesn't feel right. Let me go here. Let me, you know, it's like a different sort of drive. You don't necessarily have the inner knowledge to know at that point, you know, at those points or stages in life, like what it actually all means. You know, it kind of more comes into clarity as you get older, you know, if you're lucky. but it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think it can be, you know, an amalgamation of two things. I mean, you know, there's certainly aspects of having itchy feet and always wanting to move that may not necessarily be conducive to a sort of a solid, you know, foundation or trajectory. So it's a mix of two things. This sort of thing that informs a sort of curiosity can also be something that works against a sort of a stable foundation. And I think the balance, the key is to, you know, find a balance, and, you know, in our industry as well, like, and in life, you know, it's always finding this sort of point where you're in the right place, where both things are contributing to your journey.
Well, I think we both know well that the film business definitely attracts gypsies, you know, for sure. They're, you know, one of the reasons I'm not doing it anymore is, you know, just wanting to be more still, but it definitely attracts you know, a band of gypsies for sure, which is very interesting. So when did you shoot your first project? Like, was that when you got to the UK? Had you been fooling around with it in Australia?
Yeah, I shot my first movie in the UK. And so just to give you a little history, very briefly, when I arrived in London, it was very, very difficult to break into the industry. The unions were very restrictive about new people joining.
The hotel.
An interlude. We get announcements over the loudspeaker.
Quarantine announcements when they let you outside to exercise.
Well, when they used to let you outside to exercise.
Oh, right.
Yeah, since there's been an outbreak recently, so it's become a little more draconian.
Right.
Sorry, no, what I was saying is yeah, it was very difficult. So I arrived in London and I couldn't really work. The rule with the union was you needed to have a certain number of days on a union job to qualify for your union ticket, but to work on a union job, you needed to have a union ticket. And that was basically how it worked. So I arrived in London, sort of started to investigate how to navigate one's way through this process, and just came up against sort of brick walls everywhere. So the opportunity I had was to work on music videos, which were non-unionized. So it was great. I was very lucky. I managed to meet a couple of DPs who were working in music videos, and they invited me along, and they, you know, it was pretty crazy time, but I got in with a couple of guys who were busy, and one of my assistants, because I was working as an AC, one of my assistants went on down the track to become a director, Mike Barker, and I ended up doing his first film, which was my first movie as well.
Oh wow!
James Gang, yeah. So
what was it called?
Movie, The James Gang.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was an interesting experience for both of us. I can safely say we both learned a lot.
Mm-hmm.
We shot anamorphic, and in Wales in the winter, where
Wow.
daytime lasted about an hour and a half, and we had no budget for light, so
it was a dark film.
And it was in an era where people weren't shooting wide open on anamorphic lenses that much at that point. And even though it's become the way to work now, at that point there were a few raised eyebrows at some of the imagery. It
was an experience.
It was, yeah.
Yeah. And so what was the first big movie that you did? Like, when did you get your first opportunity to do something with some meat to it?
Well, I was very fortunate. I moved to LA like in 2006, I want to say. I've been doing a little bit of second unit on bigger films, but I got my first break. Derek Wolski was doing Pirates of the Caribbean, the third one, and he had to leave early to start another movie. So he asked if I could step in and replace him for the last month or 6 weeks of the shoot. And Derek's fantastic. He, he just said to Gore, look, I've got to leave. I'm going on to a Tim Burton movie, and this is the guy you should use. And Gore was, initially a little surprised because I had no credits, no real big movie credits to my name at all. But he was great, supportive, and that was a fantastic opportunity, and it gave me some credibility. And soon after that, I was approached by Michael Bay and asked to do one of the Transformers movies. So that was sort of my stepping stone into these big films. And as many of people listening will know, it's the same as the union issue I experienced in London. You don't get offered these sort of jobs until you've done one, and you can't get to do one until you're offered one. So it's sort of this circular, closed sort of circle situation. But it was great, and did that film with Michael Bay, and that started to open the doors to that sort of genre and that sort of scale of film.
And did you do, like, leading up to that, you did some more indie films, right? Was that?
I initially started with indie films, but what really looking at the trajectory of my career, once I got to LA, I guess by around 2000, I was I started doing second unit on these bigger films, and I did a couple of them. I did worked on the second unit on Terminator 3, I think it was, and a couple of other big films like that. And what went hand in hand with that is I went through a few years of not really doing much in indie work. I was supplementing those second unit gigs with commercials. And so it just became that was the direction things went in. But I'd really never lost my desire to stay connected to that world. And it wasn't so much the fact that they were small indie productions, but more I wanted to stay connected with stories, you know, and I think that really relates to, you know, my initial sort of love of actors and performance. You know, that's really where my interest in cinema is with these character-driven stories. So, you know, that's been something that's really stayed in my heart. But you know, as the industry works, you know, once we tend to work or start working in one area, one part of the industry, we become obviously known for that. And you know, while doors open in that area, they become a little harder to step through in other areas. So what I started to find that my association with big films was sort of scaring off indie producers, because they were, you know, worried that I would come with, you know, a huge sort of metaphorical and literal price tag in terms of what my requirements would be and equipment, and you know, would I know how to work quickly, would I know how to do small scale stuff and keep costs under control. And you know, that's always been a battle, and it's understandable. I mean, you know, it's the industry has many parallel lines, and you know, it's not a given that if you work in one particular part of it, you're able to adapt to another. But for me, it's a really important thing. And, you know, even now I'm actively trying to engage in these smaller projects, you know, story-based projects. I think it's great. And we are lucky if we have the opportunity to work in a diverse way on a variety of different arenas in the industry. I think that's great, you know, a great possibility if we're able to pull it off.
Well, and I think it's also interesting because the work that you've done in commercials, you know, you've shot some of the most beautiful, poignant commercials ever done, I think, you know, for sure, that are not huge car commercials or the army commercial, you know, they're, you know, really beautiful, like the Converse spot. Was it Converse that you did with Brian Belichick?
Yeah, fantastic.
I mean, that's such a beautiful film.
I've
and you've done so many of those.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I feel very privileged, you know, working with people like Brian and Frank Budgeon and Ringen Ledwidge, Frederick Bond. I mean, these guys are real storytellers, real filmmakers that work in that part of the industry predominantly. And, you know, great commercials are really small, short stories. And, you know, the same things apply. You know, it's a great craft, and it's a great medium for telling stories of different lengths. So, you know, feel very lucky to be able to work in, you know, in parallel in that part of the industry as well. But, you know, it's interesting. You realize again, you know, I've worked with like amazing directors and commercials who, you know, trying to make the transition into drama and into movies. It's really challenging, because there's a perception that if you're very good in one area, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll progress in another. And you know, it's frustrating, because, you know, it's great to see people being able to do that sideways step and really, bring fresh eyes and a fresh approach to the work.
Right. I think that personally, my opinion on why a lot of these very successful commercial directors have had a hard time, getting into film or long form is, they're working at like a high level in commercials, and I don't know if you can parallel step that way into high film from a high commercial. It's like you kind of have to pay your dues and do something small, and indie and, quick. And I think a lot of these commercial directors, there's a lot of control in general being a director, right? And then you step into a whole format. They're already very up here on this side. It's hard for them to come back down, ego gets in the way. Just not wanting to make sacrifices. I mean, when I did a waitlist with Jaren, we basically weren't even funded yet when we financed yet when we started shooting. Jaren spent a year location scouting on his own, and like we just dove right into it and had like a little bit of time, but it's like those were the kind of the sacrifices you had to make to try to get a film made. And I think that it's hard for some people, especially if they've been living, really well in the commercial world for a while.
So. No, I think you're right. I think that is the case in some cases. And I think that also sort of breeds a perception that, everyone will be like that. There's no doubt. I think that the shock that directors face when they are having to do their first movie, and which not always, but invariably is a small indie movie, of getting on the phone. It's like, if you want these actors, if you want this crew, if you want these people, if you want the studio to look at it, you've got to get on the phone and make the calls and do all the groundwork yourself. And I think you're right. I think, because of the nature of commercials, often there is a supportive team around the creatives that can help directors really navigate all the different battles they're having to fight. But once you're into movies, you initially, certainly you're on your own, but even ongoing, it's I see even, the directors I've worked with, some of whom are extremely experienced, and some who it's their first journey. The buck stops at you. You've got to do the work, and it's totally. Really fascinating seeing that.
Yeah, and I think it's where that self-discovery comes in. How much do you love this? Like, how much do you really want to do it? I mean, you have to have the passion. Talking to a bunch of young filmmakers on Film Roundtable, we talk about that a lot. It's like, if you don't love it with like every grain of your soul, like it's just not going to, it's not going to work. You're going to burn out.
You're absolutely right. No, that's so true. And I think, it applies to everyone. And I think, I remember listening to Greg Fraser talk about this, like the fire in your belly. And I think it really is so true, because it's not just about that motivation to get the project up and running, because it doesn't stop there. I think what's almost more important is once things have gained momentum, the nature of our industry and the way it works is we're confronted with problems and hurdles all the time, whether they're creative, logistical, political. You're just putting out fires and dealing with situations that may not necessarily feel like they're part of the creative journey. They're often not. They may be just production issues or power dynamics. But having that, being able to stand in that solid ground of like, yep, this is a problem, but I'm on the right path, and I believe in my passion for this, and I believe that we'll find the right way forward, is so helpful. I can't stress that enough in terms of when I talk to people starting out or looking for a bit of insight into how the process works. It's like, when the shit hits the fan, it's like just being able to, be solid and just say, the right thing will work out. Just got to not react, because there's a lot of, especially on these bigger productions, but not exclusively. I think that there's a lot of pressure for decisions to be made quickly, and the right decision to be made, especially when there's money involved. There are unhelpful pressures sometimes that may not necessarily guide you to the right creative solution. And so, when I talk to people that are just getting into it, I say, look, and I remember cinematographer Huey Johnson, who I used to work with, always said this to me. He said, look, don't forget that you've been hired for you. You've been hired to do this job because you bring something to the table, whatever that is. A group of people have sat down and said, we want you as a person. You must remember that, because there'll be pressure to go in other directions, and it's you're there for a reason. You specifically are there for a reason. Remember that. Remember what you can offer, and remember what you can bring to the table, and what your creative orientation is, and just stay aware of that. Through thick and thin, just stay aware of it. And that's not an argument for being stubborn and inflexible, because basically it's a collaborative process. But you'll be able to be more collaborative and supportive of your director and the production team if you are standing on solid ground. And that requires having that sort of passion inside you, that excitement about what your vision is. What's your vision of this? And it's not that you'll always be right. I mean, you might often be wrong, but you'll be able to step back from that if you really have a sound belief in yourself and what you want from the project.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's self-worth, and self-worth is important in everything you do in your life, right? I mean, if you're a father, if you're a partner, loving yourself, having self-worth, self-compassion, like creating that inside of you, you can do anything. So it makes total sense to want to come to some creative endeavor with that already in place. So you're not second guessing yourself, doubting what you're doing, worried what someone else is thinking, which are all true emotions that happen in the film business, right? Because there's a lot of things that happen very fast making a movie or a commercial. And, if you're not feeling grounded in what you're doing, you could get chipped away at a little bit. And, it's important to come to that, really feeling grounded.
I think you're right. I think that's so right. And, as part of that, when you feel that sort of groundedness, it also allows you to have a light touch, to have a light touch, because, the opposite is true. When the ground's unstable, it puts people in a position of having to make their point with added conviction, and sometimes that's not entirely helpful in a group collaboration. And I think really the greatest certainly from my experience, the greatest creative sort of journeys have been where people are in sync, and the adjustments are sort of intuitive and not minor, but within a sort of a more what I want to say, a sort of organic, focused sort of channel, if that makes sense.
Yeah, when it flows, it flows, right?
Exactly. I mean, the big swings of the pendulum where, the ship sort of, in the storm and is being battered everywhere, isn't conducive to a great, creative journey. It's
Mhm.
like, if it's a little calmer, and the boat's heading with more sort of focus in one direction, then the slight adjustments you need to make are going to be more effective, I think, and more truthful to what your ultimate goal is.
Right. Or back to the sailing metaphor, it's like if you're in rough waters and everybody's working together to like stay afloat, and that's, because sometimes in film that happens all the time, right? There's like all this stuff going on and like the core crew is like, phew, if you can stay centered and like in sync with everyone, then you can handle the really rough patches, right? Because it's definitely not always easy.
Exactly. No, so true. You're right. So true.
Can you tell me a little bit about some of your film inspiration over your lifetime? Like a couple of films that really, when you watched them, like you knew deep inside, like, I want to make a film like that, or God, that's how I want this to look, or, just really strong memories for you?
Yeah, I can, absolutely. And I think one of my first ones was, as a young kid, going to see 2001 was a turning point, because I wasn't really aware of cinema as a kid. I mean, I just wasn't. I mean, we didn't have a cinema for a start. It's like movies were like something we saw on our crappy TV that, we had 2 channels in New Zealand when I grew up. So, as a youngster, when I first went to Wellington, which is the capital.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? Isn't it crazy to think about that you only had 2 channels not that long ago only, and now it's like, I just wanted to just get some perspective about that quick evolution that happened there.
So true.
But
and you know what? Even funnier than that, I mean, this is going to sound like I grew up in the 1800s, but the second channel, it required one of us to get on the roof of the house and adjust the aerial, because the reception was so bad that if we wanted, there was a program coming up, at 8 at night, someone had to clamber up in the dark, twist the aerial slightly to the north,
right.
and then the signal from the living room, like, yeah, that's okay, come back down. But yeah, I've just aged myself. But anyway,
you look great.
Yeah. So I got to go to Wellington. I guess I don't even know how old I was, but I must have been 8, 9, something like that, and watched 2001. And I think, obviously I was way before I had any sort of, not even technical knowledge, but any sort of understanding of what movies were. But what my take out of it was, I came out of the cinema, and I'd been to another place. I mean, I'd been to another place in my psyche and emotional state and in my heart that I just didn't even know existed. And that's really was the initial fueling, because, and that really informed, I think, ultimately my orientation and passion for cinema. And it was really not, it wasn't so much a love of storytelling, but it was more something on a poetic level, where I didn't understand what exactly had moved me, but I'd been moved by a process and a medium that was beyond explanation, certainly at 9 years old. But
yeah,
I felt moved, and I was hooked, because I was hooked into the feeling of being moved in a way that I'd never been moved. And at that age also, you're like a sponge. You're so vulnerable and able to be influenced by things. And that then took me, on a particular path of movies that I really responded to. Terrence Malick's films, obviously, Russian cinema. I mean, I guess I found that the fascination for me in the movies that really affected me was the unknown. It was the unknown combination of all the great things that inform great cinema combining to be transformative. And I think nothing's changed. I'm still totally transfixed when I go to a movie and I'm transported to a different place. And I'll often go with people who aren't in agreement, who may have different levels of connection to different types of films, but that for me is the standard. If I'm moved, and I've had endless arguments and discussions. I think I've lost friendships over disagreements over films, because I can come out of a film that may have not received great critical acclaim, and I'll something will have spoken to me. And Malik's films, a few of them speak to that. And it's not that I love every one of Malik's films without exception. I just generally relate to that level of language in cinema.
Totally.
And not that level in the sense that there's a hierarchical level, but that level in terms of the way he communicates through that medium. It that's what I respond to probably more than great complex plots and twists. Even great performances. It's not that they're less for me. It's just I want to be moved when I go to the movies, and I know that's not original, but it really is something that's so important to me. To that magic, the magic of the combined elements of a great story, of incredible music, of believable performances and great characterization, and how that all merges and melds into just transporting you. That's everything for me. It's stating the obvious, I know, but it's that unknown. And I think that's, I hope it's not sort of sounding pretentious and ostentatious to say that it's the poetry of cinema that is important to me, but I think that's the only way I can sort of understand it, I guess.
Well, I think that it is what you're talking about is stories that open up the empathy in you, and kind of touch you on a deeper level than just in your mind. It's how your body reacts to it, which is like the mind heart, as opposed to the cerebral aspect of it, which I really relate to as well. Like I love films that maybe don't have any ending, and you really wonder about these people and where they're going and what they're doing. I mean, in 2001, by the end of it, you're like, oh my God, like what reality is he in right now? Is he, I mean, it's so wild. It's so funny that you said that, because we had our kids watch that film over a quarantine, and, my kids are 15 and 13, and they hated it so much. Wow. Really? Hated it. But to the point that they talk about it all the time. So it's going to be one of those movies that they go back to in their 20s, and they're going to be like, oh my God, my mom made me watch that film. And wow, like I kind of get it now. But in the moment, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's so much other material out there now that is not like that at all, and here you are, a 9-year-old kid who walks into that film, and of course your mind is blown, because your mind is blown. You're like, wait, is that what can happen to me? Like, what's going on? There's so many different layers to that film, of where it takes
totally. You. And you're right, and it really, what as a 9-year-old, what sort of experience can create a sort of existential crisis for you.
Totally.
In terms of entertainment. It's like, and that's, I think that just stayed with me. But, I think you're so right. I think it's sort of troubling to me because I have a very similar story with my kids, my younger kids. You know, I have a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old, and just being aware of not just how much screen time kids have now, but how they're inundated with imagery and sound that is sort of abusive is the wrong word, but it's sort of not entirely the wrong word.
Yeah, it's relentless.
It's relentless, but it's like an attack on the senses, and I think you become desensitized. So, you know, I felt, you know, I can't remember. I watched a film with them recently that I found really moving. Oh, it was the South African documentary about the octopus. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I found it extraordinary and beautiful, and just I was so excited to show them because, in the same way, I sort of thought, wow, this is something that is timeless and will appeal to everyone because it's a story of great humanity and connection with real things. You know, it's nature. It's someone really exploring something, and they hated it same way. And I just couldn't believe it. I was like, I wanted to disown my own kids. I was like, how can you hate this? You're like smart kids, and this is like beautiful. But I think they just are just not used to having, you know, watching stuff on a screen that spoke in that language. It's like, I don't know, I guess the metaphor is, you know, if someone's used to, you know, hearing someone speak English to them and communicate them with in English or a certain language, and then one day, you know, you just start speaking, you know, Swahili or German or, you know, French to them, they're just going to look at you blankly. It's like, I don't get it. What are you saying? And I know it's an extreme analogy, but in a way, I think there's a part of that's true. It's like, you know, what, and this really speaks to the big, well, not a bigger question, but a parallel question about our movies and, you know, how much, you know, is how much of our visual entertainment are these sort of shows now, which are, you know, heavy hitting sort of moments of entertainment. They, you know, the loss of nuance and subtlety, and not, you know, and a lot of cinema is you know, in my mind is a shame. And I understand that, you know, I mean, ultimately the film industry is a business, and, you know, a lot of the trajectory of our industry, you know, it's got to make money, it's got to be viable. But, you know, really also cinema's an art, and art has the power to, you know, transcend and transform people. And it's a separate thing. It's like we need to separate and really try and keep alive the part of the industry that maybe isn't so financially sort of sturdy. You know, it's I think it's really important. It's an art form, and this is what is, you know, culturally so important to maintain. So, you know, again, just informs, you know, for me, a real desire to stay connected and do everything I can to support more independent sort of work and be involved in it. You know, the smaller footprint projects.
Yeah, and especially after this moment in time we've had, right? I mean, the amount of stories that I'm sure are going to need to be told, you know, in the next coming years after this experience, you know, and most of those stories aren't going to be able to be told on a large scale, right? They're going to probably have to be told on a small scale, and I think that is so important for us as a society to hear those stories and hear all of the experiences of this like worldwide collective pause that's been going on for almost a year now, and the beauty that's come out of it, the suffering that's come out of it, how we connect with our fellow humans and what they've gone through, in a way that isn't just reading the stupid 24-hour a day news cycle. It's really hearing how people are expressing their voices to feel into what their experiences were. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the business adjusts to that or doesn't, in the coming years, while people are, needing to heal and talk about what they've gone through. So I hope that all those stories, or a lot of them, can find their place, where we can hear about what's been happening.
I agree, and I think that you're right. When you just think about the last year, I mean, if I was someone with some resources to make a few movies now, there's limitless potential for unbelievable stories. I mean, unbelievable. I mean, limitless numbers on every possible level and every genre and every type. You think
in every country,
sort of in every country. I mean, limitless. Just think about it. And then the South African variant came along. It's like, you can't write this stuff. It's
you cannot write any of it
collectively. Over the last year. I mean, politically, I mean, if someone had pitched, this is a movie, this year,
right,
we laughed out of the meeting. I mean, think about it on so many levels, but there you go.
I know, just even thinking about it, like in the last month or so, since the end of December came and like the beginning of January and coming up into a year, like I spent a lot of time like pausing and being like, oh my God, a year ago, this was just not even anything on my radar. Like I never in a billion years would have I thought we'd been in this place. And that's really wild to think and reflect on where you were a year ago. Like we every year I always write a letter to myself from at the end of the year for the following year about, just kind of things I want to release, things I want to bring into my life, and wowza. And so I got the whole family to do it this year, like everybody write, so they can go back and look at it the following year. But it's really, it's been a wild freaking ride. And it's and it's also just a real, visual of the shift in the paradigm. That's like, when they look back in the history books, of how much in evolution and just in the overall shift of the world we're living in, like this is kind of where it began. It wasn't exactly where it began, but this is like a real visual of like, oh wow, a lot started to shift then, and that's really, it's a lot. It's heavy. It's a lot of stuff.
It's a lot.
Yeah. So what do you what are you hoping for yourself in the future as far as filmmaking? Like what are you working on? What would you like to be doing now that we've had this big shift? How do you want to, what stories do you want to be telling?
I think in some sense, not much has changed. I'm keen to do as much, story-based work as I can. I mean, like really human stories. I know that doesn't really sound, doesn't articulate very well my desires, but I think, as I was saying, a push to do more independent work. I think I feel, hugely lucky to work in a range of different genres and scales. I've really enjoyed over the last couple of years doing a bit more documentary work. currently starting to hope to start a small independent movie in a few weeks. So, and I think that's great. That's really what I love. So, you know, push the boundaries a little. It was really interesting. I just did a short writing course recently because I became really aware of my desire to understand the material I was reading and working on to a better degree, and that's been just such a fascinating exploration. You know, just to really appreciate really what the writer's world is, and the journey to get a screenplay together and have it coherent and, you know, make sense, and also tick all the boxes required of the writers often on a lot of projects. I felt really pleased to have put a bit more energy into exploring that. You know, really made me appreciate their work and the director's work more. And that also, I think, ultimately helps me as a cinematographer be a better collaborator too. And I think that stands for really everyone in the industry, to understand a little bit more of the role of the people you're working with. You can be more useful to them, and you can certainly do your work better, you know. And I think that's one thing is really important to me. It's really to push, you know, the boundaries a bit of what I'm able to contribute, because I find there's a lot of talk, you know, especially with cinematographers and in our world, there's a lot of technical talk and a lot of excitement. You know, there's great, huge advances of technology, and there's all sorts of really exciting stuff happening. But sometimes the focus on the technical talk can take your eye off the ball a bit. And the ball is the story and the creator, what ideas you're bringing to your work as a creative. That's really the key. And sometimes the emphasis on technicals can hide or bury that a little. It's like, you know, the analogy I use, it's like, you know, getting excited about the map. It's like, it is good to get excited about the map. It's you know, that's your way of viewing the world, but it's the territory that's really of interest. You know, it's what's out there, what can you bring to it. And, you know, I think that's an important thing for me. It's like, you know, the technical side will be able to take care of it, not take care of itself, but will be able to take care of itself in the sense that you'll get there and there are people that will help you with that stuff. But don't get too caught up in it if you're not, you know, if you're not like totally focused in that area. Your energy, you have a certain amount of creative energy, and the key is to channel that energy in the right direction, I think, and use it in a, you know, because our industry is really collaborative, use it in a helpful way, and, you know, really help your director and the team, you know, get to the best place you all can as a group.
Yeah.
So
and
I think
also
that's
supporting yourself with, if you don't have that technical side to yourself, supporting yourself with crew who does, you know, that you can lean on for those sort of things.
Absolutely. And it's there, and things are changing so quickly too. And I think it sometimes creates a lot of pressure for, especially, you know, if you're starting out, maybe that's not your comfort zone.
Mm.
And there's a lot of discussion online about technicals and technique. And it's great, it's exciting, but it's really a resource. It's not the ultimate guide. You know, the thing is to be in tune with, you know, what the story needs. And I think it's you know, it's analogous to really what's happening in a lot of society now where, you know, style over content is seen often as having a higher cachet. It's like, you know, because it's so hard to or put it this way, it's often challenging for really important stories to be told, or original things to be original stories to be told. It's, you know, that the emphasis on style, maybe indirectly, becomes more important. And it's, you know, that's something just to be, I guess, just to be mindful of a little, you know.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, I think that it brings up a point of just also that it is a collaborative, you know, art, filmmaking, and that it's okay to not know absolutely everything, you know, and to bring your strengths forward, and then have the people, you know, have support from the people around you, you know, which
Totally
I
right.
think is
And
really not making yourself feel like you've got to do everything and control it all. Like, instead you can, you know, you can lean on other people, because they're all there for the same purpose.
I think you're right. And you know, certainly the, you know, creative people I've worked with who I've really admired and respected, you know, directors and designers and, you know, costume designers, producers, you know, people that really, in whatever creative contribution they're making, the ones I see that are really successful, and I don't mean successful in the conventional sense of being acknowledged from others, but really truly successful, the ones that are open about the fact they don't know everything, and, and are willing to reach out and listen to everyone's input, and aren't threatened, or, again, going back to that earlier point, aren't necessarily banging that drum too loud, but open, so they can, from a position of intuition, can say, yes, yeah, I like that. No, it's not quite right for what we're trying to achieve. Look, help me. This is what I want to do, but I just don't know how to get there. They're really relevant conversations for everyone to have. You know, it's really important to, I think, to be able to say comfortably, hey, I've got an idea, but it's not well formed. You know, can you help me? Can you help me get there? I don't even know if it's a good idea, but it just feels right. I think for creatives to be able to say that is important. And again, I think sometimes we're under pressure to have all the answers, you know, immediately. Think, oh, but I think that's something, you know, again, as I was saying, you know, the people I find that are most comfortable with the process are okay with that, you know, and I think, you know, speaking a lot about, you know, a lot of the directors I work with are just great, you know, helps them get to that point of their ultimate creativity, you know.
Yeah, I think it's very important to be vulnerable, you know, and people look at vulnerability as like a weakness, and it actually is a really great personality trait, you know, to be able to have confidence enough to be vulnerable. And that's how some of the best ideas come about, right? I mean, I feel like I spent so much of my career like swallowing my ideas because, you know, I was working with mostly men, or, you know, I just didn't feel confident enough. And, you know, but I had great ideas, and it's, you know, it's so much time is wasted being that way. It's really much more productive and fulfilling when you say things that you might think sound stupid, but that's how you kind of get to a place where you can create more, you know, more expansively, I guess.
Totally, I totally agree. I think that's a you know, a sort of lesson in life, really. You're right. It's you know, and you know it's right because you know how much better you feel when you can say, hey, I don't know, and you can feel comfortable. Imagine, like, if you go back to when you were a teenager or a kid or a young adult, and to really be able to say I don't know feels challenging. It feels challenging. And I think I don't know, the more I sort of come to a better place in my creative journey, and being able to go, I just don't know. I really don't know. And it's not, I don't know doesn't mean I'm stupid. It doesn't mean I don't care. It means, there's a really good version of I don't know, which is just, like you say, it's just being open, because you're opening a creative tap at that point, because you're not letting your inhibitions or your lack of self-worth block that channel, which is the creative channel, which is not, and when I say the creative channel, I don't mean like as a filmmaker limited to that. I mean your creative sort of life channel of being, the best version of yourself you can be, which sounds very deep suddenly. So apologies for that.
No, it's good. I think that these, it's important to kind of think into this stuff when you're building a career, especially, or in it, just it's important to be yourself and speak when you need to speak, and express yourself. So I think
Right.
it's important. I have a question, like how do you establish a relationship with the directors that you work with? Obviously lots of different personalities there, so I'm sure knowing you kind of chameleon into situations, on what kind of person you're working with. But do you have things as a DP that are standard for when you start a project with someone? Like,
I never come to work before 12. No.
yeah, you don't get out of bed for less than 10K a day.
Yeah. No, I guess there's two aspects to that. I think, from initial meetings, it's interesting to gauge, different directors. No two directors are the same, no two anyone is the same, but certainly in terms of what a director would like you to bring to the table, and what their process is, and what they need of you is always changing, and to quite a marked degree. That's been something that's really fascinated me, and has been something I've really been interested in. And I think, really, without going into too much explicit detail, I think the most useful thing I could say in it is, the stage one is, as we were saying earlier, is just be yourself. I mean, be really, really, especially if you're going into a challenging project, really be honest about, even before you go into a meeting, like who you are, understand what you're able to bring to it. And then when you meet a director, it's interesting just to be as open as you can, because you'll work out if, it may be that you're not compatible. And it's better to find out that you're not compatible, and it may be through probably through no one's fault, but it's better to find out that you're not compatible before you jump into a process with someone that can be, very, very intense experience. And I've just found that's the best rule, because ultimately, pretending is really tough. I mean, it's really hard work to pretend, and to pretend for weeks and, months on end is really, really tough, I think. And it's just, you're not honoring your own journey. So I think, in terms of answering that question, the trust comes from that, really, because people sense when you're being yourself, and being yourself can be, being very vocal about what works for you, what doesn't. But I think, as I said before, if you're feeling comfortable about where you're standing in a certain situation, you're able to tread lightly. And treading lightly is important for that trust to build. It enables the voices to be a bit more subdued and have a bit more power, everyone's voices in the process. And that, I think, ultimately that's where you want to be, with the voices down a few notches on the volume, only because not only because it's more fun and more pleasant, the process, but it allows the creativity to bubble up, the better ideas. I think it's very rare. I've worked in pretty toxic creative environments, a few, and people don't function well. I learned that sort of late with myself in terms of working under people who just had toxicity as part of their sort of makeup for whatever reason. I grew up in that sort of environment a little, so I think it was familiar to me when I went to work and we were working with people like that. But it wasn't great for me. It was a sort of weird psychological thing that I probably need a few more years of analysis to work it out. But basically, I was there and it didn't work for me. And I then realized in the past I'd been like that sometimes too. You pass that on, and I was like, this is not great for anyone. And so yeah, be yourself and be open and honest, and avoid toxic situations or at least avoid the help to deconstruct the potential for that to build, because I think as we've seen this year, even politically, that the ability for negativity and sort of negative forms of tribalism to grow up is just not great. Working together and in a positive way is always better. Finding common ground, even when there's disagreement, so important. Even if you know that it might not be a blissful journey or perfect, it's better to find the common ground than stand in your camp and defend it, against someone that's just not going to agree with you. I think that's not conducive to a good creative process.
Yeah, because then it just becomes cyclical. It's like violent communication happening, again and again, as opposed to approaching someone in a more nonviolent way. And then that comes back, people are feeling heard. And I think that's very important in this business, is, trying to really feel into when someone's like activating you in a certain way and responding back in the opposite way, like they're being heard, and then you're saying what you need to say, and then you can come to much more of a common ground quicker. And that's not always easy on a film set because things are, happening quickly, but I think it really helps, neutralize situations when that's a good book to read, Nonviolent Communication, by the way, for probably many people on set.
Right.
It's great.
No, you're right. I agree. And it's such a useful sort of thing to apply in our industry, with the pressures, the as you say, it's a lot of pressure, and it's filtering out that unnecessary stuff, so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's like we're not in a life or death situation business, it's really, we're here for entertainment and to honestly, heal, because these stories are when people get their stories out, that's medicine right there. And it's interesting how quickly it can turn into very volatile, not so friendly situations. And, it's like everybody kind of needs to take a step back and have some perspective, which I'm sure this year has offered many people. I know for sure it's offered many people like, hey, I don't really want to be involved with that person anymore, or I'm never going to take a project like that anymore, or I'm not going to be away from my family for that long. Lots of really positive awakenings have happened in this past year. So it'll be interesting to see how the studios and how everybody adapts to that. And, the problem is we're still, in a bit of a hamster wheel in this world as far as like making money, living lifestyles, all of that. So there's always seems to be people who will take a job if somebody else won't. But maybe it's the beginning to a shift of how we all want to exist in the world, and not be like constantly racing around and not enjoying where we are in the moment, that's just so important. And so much of like the lessons I've been learning lately is just really sitting with feeling really good and having my body remember what that feels like. And then when I'm in situations, I know much quicker when I'm like, okay, this doesn't feel good, or wow, this feels really good. How come I've never really enjoyed this moment before in time, why was I always rushing to do something else when this was like fully blissed out moment, of like simplicity. And, those are the things I would love to see like people in this business, wake up to. I think so much more creativity can come out of that, if we're working from that space, as opposed to like a panic space or
I think
so.
you're right. I think I think there is happening and will continue to happen a sort of paradigm shift like that, because ultimately these sort of changes, I think, start subtly, in terms of, the direction changes. And obviously there's been a huge catalyst for the direction to change.
Mhm.
But as we see that there's better ways of working and kinder ways of working and ways that are gentler on your family and your time. Our industry's a little archaic, or has been, in terms of, sort of hours we've been working, and really without really acknowledgement. I mean, you can understand it. I mean, it's even, you could even argue that in some sense it's justifiable, because it's a crazy industry where there's just so many variables, and it's very intense, and there's a lot of money at stake sometimes, and you can see why we fall into these traps. But when you think, in this day and age, that the time commitment, the time required for you to be away from your family without real support for a lot of people is huge. And, listen, it's an amazing privilege and a huge opportunity. I'm not saying, look, you don't have to do it. You could do, it's just been an industry, I think, that could really benefit from more support in many ways for the individuals, for everyone working in it, because it's just better, and there's no reason for it not to be like that. I mean, there's just no reason for it not to be like that. We need to look after our people and their families and create like communities, because it's just nice, it's more fun, it's creatively, it's going to pay off, it'll pay dividends if people feel looked after. And I think that's important.
Yeah. And I think it's, hopefully, I mean, right now we live in a world that's so built on making money, right? And more money and more money and more money, that all of this scaffolds that. And the trickle down is so minimal, from who's making the money and who isn't, It's interesting. I went to India. I lived in Asia for 2 years in the 90s, and I spent a lot of time in India. And one of my big takeaways from India was how there was really no middle class then, right? You had this really, really wealthy class, and then poverty, and nothing really in between. And then I went back to India in 2013, I think, to film for a month. And in that time span of, I don't know if it was 15 years, 20 years, about, maybe a little less, but there had become a middle class, like full on middle class there, because that in that time period, a lot of people started output, like out, what do they call that? Outsourcing jobs to places like India from the US, right? And probably China too. And so like the telemarketers were from India, there was lots of animation happening in India, like there was a whole thing. And so that society completely changed in a really short period of time, which really, like, I was like, wow. And it's almost like the opposite is happening here in America. The disparity between the very wealthy and the very poor is huge. There are a lot more people living underneath the poverty level, and fewer in between who are able to like make ends meet anymore, because for a number of reasons. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but so I think that it's interesting to me making that observation of like what's happening over time in this country compared to maybe some other countries, and how we're kind of going backwards. And when is that gonna, like, it will take generations for it to shift back, but it just, the film business is one of the.
Oh yeah, and hopefully not generations. I mean, I think sometimes for change to happen, you have to go to the extreme, to one end, and I think that's been one of the huge. You're right. One of the huge realizations of this year is that rather than what people would have hoped, a sort of collective enemy would create a sense of unity. It has to some degree in small areas, but this disparity is really a thing, a huge thing. And I think you're right. That's going to, I hope, be addressed, be forced to be addressed sooner rather than later. Yeah. It has to be.
So that just brings me to the question about diversity and inclusivity on film sets. And have you been thinking about that at all, of like how to be more inclusive on film sets or in your crews? Or I mean, it's hard because obviously people that we want to diversify with have never really been given an opportunity to move up in the ladder of the film hierarchy, to even be grips or electrics or prop people. I mean, at least in the United States. And so I'm just something I think about a lot in all of my shoots. I'm always trying to get the most diverse crew possible. And it's just so crazy how hard it is. Like, it is so hard, especially if you're shooting in places where, there really isn't diversity at all, which exists a lot of places in America.
Yeah.
And I'm sure in Australia and New Zealand too,
Absolutely. No, we've been paying the price, and the industry's been paying the price for being so closed, and it's great to see that's being addressed, and it's even better to see that the results of that, slowly but surely being addressed, is just this explosion of new talent and great minds, and people that horrifyingly were, some of whom might not have had an opportunity. It's just it's mind-boggling to think how backward our industry's been. So yeah, I'm pleased. It is slow. It's slowly changing, too slow, but at least there is some change in the right direction. And I feel like I'm just starting to see that situation being being the beginning of it being addressed, and
Mm-hmm.
benefits are there and speak for themselves for the industry as a whole. You know, I sort of, I find it, you know, pretty depressing to think how as an industry we've been so backward for so long, but it's being addressed, and it's, there's all sorts of teething troubles and reactions and negativity sometimes as well, and I think that's inevitable when there are big sort of shifts, but we've got momentum in the right direction, and that's important. It's important.
And I think we're going to have a couple of roundtables coming up that talk about these mentorship programs that are coming up. One in Georgia, this organization in California called Media Alliance. Ethan Tobin, the production designer, has started one called Hollywood Pipeline, and
Right.
just how much work it takes, and how it's not, you can't just pick someone up who's interested in film and plop them into the business as an intern. I mean, there's a lot of scaffolding that's involved. And yeah, so I think that people are hopefully going to start to learn a little bit more about how much effort needs to go into, to starting teaching kids, and whether they're in high school, about this work and how to keep jobs and how to, finding out what their interest is, and that, you don't really need, a lot of people are attracted to, like, oh, I want to be an actor or a director or a writer, that, it's really hard. Not everybody's going to be that, as we know, and how do we teach skills to people at a young age that can maybe incite interests into areas that they might have not as thought of before. Maybe they're really good at building things, or they love working. Most people on a film set, most people who don't work on film sets might not even realize they're carpenters, like on a set. I mean, most people don't really know the structure of the pyramid, and how these things get made. Who know, how many people know what a grip is, but there could be a million people out there who are really great at, like, rigging things or MacGyvering things, or coming up with, like, really clever things for that.
I think in one of the issues, the sort of meritocratic sort of element of the industry has always been seen as a sort of badge of honor. It's like, you work really hard and you'll be the one picked, but it's moot, because the problem is, if you're keeping out a whole part of the community, if historically, that option hasn't, the whole system's undermined anyway, and you're failing on every level, because great, it's fine to say, yeah, the best person will get the job. Well, if you're saying the best person will get the job, and your pool is already a very limited type and number of people, that's an issue in itself. But also, the system can't work like that, because by helping everyone rise to the top, that's what's required. I mean, that's what has to happen, and it serves everyone at that point. It serves the industry, and it serves the people that are working, and serves the people that have been excluded. It's a win all around. And I think, as I said, I think we're going, our industry is pretty archaic, as I said, in many areas, and there's progress, but there's very entrenched sort of attitudes and ways of thinking, and I think it's part of a bigger shift, that incorporates all this sort of stuff of working in a more human way, you know, the way the work system is, and the way it needs to be more inclusive, the way it needs to be more supportive. These are all things that need to be addressed, and slowly but surely are, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what you say about, you know, helping everyone around us, even those who are very different from us in our communities, rise to the top, benefits everyone, you know. And I think that's what a lot of people don't realize, you know. They don't realize that even those who we might not, you know, interact with very much or whatnot. And I'm talking like on a global scale too. I mean, the more we all try to have the same goal, in the end, the better off we're all going to be.
Yeah.
So
absolutely, it's absolutely true. And it's, you know, finally we're getting there, I think, slowly.
All right. Well, I want to ask, we've been talking for like an hour and a half, so we'll wanted to ask, like, what have you been watching anything lately? I mean, such a weird time to try to watch movies, not being able to go to the cinema, but I'm sure, like me, you're getting a lot of screeners or things online. Have you watched anything that's come out this year that you really want to flag or really felt strongly about?
Yeah, watch Burden. I won't say anything more than that.
I have that screener. Who did that? I didn't.
Now you're putting me on the spot.
Okay, sorry.
I literally just I feel absolutely embarrassed. I should
Oh,
look
look.
up, you know,
Yeah.
there, but it's so it's just speaks to everything we've been talking about, but, you know, particularly a certain sort of dynamic in society at the moment, politically, you know, racially. It's a historical film, but wow, it was.
Oh, is it
so,
with Forrest Whitaker?
that's it. Yeah.
Is he in it? Okay, yeah. So it's Andrew Heckler.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, he did it.
Terrific film. So, you know, just you know, a comment on society, humanity, and you know, our failings, really, and successes, and really tremendously moving, powerful film. The Extraordinaries with Vincent Cassel is great film. Great, you know, film about two social workers in Paris, and it's just, you know, you watch these films and you think, God, it's like I can sort of imagine pitching that film, like someone pitching it in Hollywood, and just I can imagine the reaction that would have happened, because the premise is not something that feels like you know, easily popular material, accessible material, but it's terrific film. I've also been revisiting the films of Andrei Zieg. I always get his name wrong. Ziegantsev.
Is he Russian?
Russian, yeah. Who did? Most people know his film Leviathan from a few years ago, 3 years ago. All his films are unbelievable. I mean, just fantastic, and really speak to the power of cinema. They're all very different stylistically, but great films. You know, amazing number of really diverse, interesting things going on at the moment. And, you know, obviously in television, there's just great stuff, really stuff going on.
Did you have a favorite show this year? Like a favorite series? Did you watch anything, binge watch anything?
Yeah, do I have a favorite? Yeah, a few. I've just got into Queen's Gambit.
That's so good. Yeah,
Good.
it's a lot of fun.
Particularly, God, I've got so many recently. Sam Levinson's project, Euphoria, is just mind blowing. Just loved it. Loved it. Succession is terrific.
Marc likes that a lot. Yeah.
What else? Oh, a few things. Yeah, watched The Last Dance over the last few nights, which has been great.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you watch News of the World?
Not yet.
I really liked that a lot. I thought that it was so relevant to what exactly is going on right now, which I found so wild since they made the movie it was during Trump, obviously, but not during this past year. Yeah, it was just, I thought it was really well done. But I think Paul Greengrass is a really interesting filmmaker. And Derek shot that. We just had Derek and Derek Walsky and Billy, the editor from that film, on the roundtable together, like the last 2 weeks or so, because it's an interesting roundtable. And I haven't watched a lot at all because I really don't watch television much at all, except if I get stuck watching something with my kids, which lately is, well, my son is all Marvel. Like we just watch Marvel again and again. I want to shoot myself, but he's so into it and he loves it, and he has like a Marvel encyclopedia that he just knows everything. So I'm totally there with him. But I just watched Promising Young Woman last night, which is Carey Mulligan. The director's name is her first feature. Her name is Emerald. I can't remember her last name, Fairling maybe. And it's a gender bender. It's good. I really, really liked it a lot. And I won't give anything away, but I found myself at the end of it wanting to criticize it a little bit for certain things. And I found that was like the point of the whole movie. It really was like making a point about men in society and in the patriarch and all of that, and how we're all so patterned, or like to question when something is so one way. I don't know if I can explain it correctly, but anyway, I highly recommend it. It's very, very, very interesting. And she is fantastic in it. Like she's so good. She is great. And I haven't seen her in anything in a while. And I just thought so great.
Oh, fantastic. I'll look forward to that.
So that one's good. And then I haven't really watched much of anything else, but I have a million screeners, so eventually I'll get into some of them. But
there's like 5,000 movies up for Oscars this year.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's such a different way to watch things. Like normally I'll go to the cinema to see what I really want to see, and then I'll watch the screener of something else that I maybe didn't get a chance to see, and then I make a point to go to the film, go to the cinema and see those on big screen. And now it's just so weird watching everything on the TV or on the computer.
It doesn't feel crazy. I can't wait for that moment where we'll be able to, go back in. I think there's just going to be this huge, massive collective desire to do things as a community, as a group, and I can't wait that feeling of rushing to the cinema and being able to experience a movie with a group of people. It feels like it's going to be such a treat and something that's been missed, and is, we're going to be able to celebrate in such a positive way.
No, for sure. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Really great conversation.
Yeah,
as always. Yeah. Yeah, Zephyr's like down in the kitchen now. He's like, all right,
Yeah,
Mom,
bring some food. I'm
let's
hungry.
finish it up. But yeah, so thank you so much. And as always, really great talking to you.
Thanks, Erin.
And yeah, let me know how it feels to be free tomorrow.
I will.
Yeah.
I feel very fortunate. I'll keep you posted.
Yeah. All right. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care.
Bye. Bye.
Do you use this to cut bread?